Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 19 in our History Bite series. Today, we will discuss the Boston Tea Party, which was the first major act of defiance to British rule over the colonists in the American colonies. Tensions between England and the American colonies had been building for years. In the 1760s, Britain was deep in debt, so the British Parliament imposed a series of taxes on American colonists to help pay those debts. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed colonists on virtually every piece of printed paper they used, from playing cards and business licenses to newspapers and legal documents. The Townshend Acts of 1767 went a step further, taxing essentials such as paint, paper, glass, lead, and tea. The British government felt the taxes were fair since much of its debt was earned fighting wars on the colonists' behalf. The colonists, however, disagreed. They were furious at being taxed without having any representation in Parliament and felt it was wrong for Britain to impose taxes on them to gain revenue. A storm of colonial protest and noncompliance led to the repeal of these taxes in 1770, except the duty on tea, which was retained by Parliament to demonstrate its presumed right to raise such colonial revenue without colonial approval. It wasn't about to give up the tax revenue on the nearly 1.2 million pounds of tea that the colonists drank every year. The merchants of Boston circumvented the act by continuing to receive tea smuggled in by Dutch traders. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to aid the financially troubled British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on all tea exported to the colonies, an exemption on the export tax, and a refund on duties owed to certain surplus quantities of tea in its possession. The tea sent to the colonies was to be carried only in East India Company ships and sold only through its own agents, bypassing the independent colonial shippers and merchants. It allowed the British East India Company to sell tea to the colonies duty-free and much cheaper than other tea companies, but still taxed the tea when it reached colonial ports. The perception of monopoly drove the normally conservative colonial merchants into an alliance with radicals led by Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty. In cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, tea agents resigned or canceled orders, and merchants refused consignments. In Boston, however, the royal governor Thomas Hutchinson determined to uphold the law and maintain that three arriving ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, should be allowed to deposit their cargoes and that appropriate duties should be honored. The Sons of Liberty were a group of colonial merchants and tradesmen founded to protest the Stamp Act and other forms of taxation. The group of revolutionists included prominent patriots such as Benedict Arnold, Patrick Henry, and Paul Revere, as well as Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Led by Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty held meetings rallying against British Parliament and protested the Griffin's Wharf arrival of Dartmouth, a British East India Company ship carrying tea. By December 16, 1773, Dartmouth had been joined by her sister ships, Beaver and Eleanor, all three ships loaded with tea from China. That morning, as thousands of colonists convened at the wharf and its surrounding streets, a meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House where a large group of colonists voted to refuse to pay taxes on the tea or allow the tea to be unloaded, stored, sold, or used. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of about 100 men, encouraged by a large crowd of Bostonians, donned blankets and Native American headdresses, marched to Griffin's Wharf, boarded the ships, and dumped 342 tea chests valued at 18,000 pounds into the water in Boston Harbor. It took nearly 3 hours before the last chest of tea was thrown overboard. The chests held more than 90,000 pounds of tea, which would cost nearly $1 million in today's money. Said Patriot George Hughes, "We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of the water." Hughes also noted that we were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. While some important colonial leaders, such as John Adams, were thrilled to learn Boston Harbor was covered in tea leaves, others were not. In June of 1774, George Washington wrote, "The cause of Boston ever will be considered as the cause of America." But his personal views of the event were far different. He voiced strong disapproval of their conduct in destroying the tea and claimed Bostonians, quote, were mad. Washington, like other elites, held the belief that private property was sanctified and not to be touched by others. Benjamin Franklin insisted the British East India Company be reimbursed for the lost tea and even offered to pay for it himself. No one was hurt, and aside from the destruction of the tea and a padlock, no property was damaged or looted during the Boston Tea Party. The participants reportedly swept the ship's decks clean before they left. Due to the costumes the participants were wearing, only one of the Tea Party culprits, Francis Akeley, was arrested and imprisoned. In retaliation, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures called the Coercive Acts, but known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, including the Boston Port Bill, which shut off the city's sea trade pending payment for the destroyed tea. These measures also ended the Massachusetts Constitution, ended free elections of town officials, and moved judicial authority to Britain and British judges, basically creating martial law in Massachusetts. It also required colonists to quarter British troops on demand and extended freedom of worship to French Canadian Catholics under British rule, which angered the mostly Protestant colonists. The British government's efforts to single out Massachusetts for punishment served only to unite the colonies and impel the drift toward war. Many colonists felt Britain's coercive acts went too far. On September 5, 1774, elected delegates from the American colonies, except Georgia, met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress to figure out how to resist British oppression. The delegates were divided on how to move forward, but the Boston Tea Party had united them in their fervor to gain independence. By the time they adjourned in October 1774, they'd written the Declaration and Resolves, which censored Britain for passing the Coercive Acts and called for their repeal, established a boycott of British goods, declared the colonies had the rights to govern independently, and rallied colonists to form and train a colonial militia. Britain didn't capitulate, and within months the shot heard round the world rang out in Concord, Massachusetts, sparking the start of the American Revolutionary War, which ended with the colonies gaining independence from Great Britain in 1783 and the creation of the United States of America. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.